to us today about the New Bedford fisheries today. John is the regional manager for NOAA Fisheries, and he works with coastal states from North Carolina to Maine, 2 fishery management councils, the fishing industry, and other stakeholders to manage federal, commercial, and recreational fisheries, marine mammals, and habitats. He oversees critical aspects of international fishery conservation and management in the region. He's the past president of Sea Education Associate, former mayor of New Bedford, and former director of NOAA's Office of Sustainable Development. It's my pleasure to introduce John Bullard, and I hope you'll join us tonight for the filming of Sacred Cod, which I watched last night with great interest. And John is very much part of the movie, so enjoy him this afternoon, and then you'll see him again tonight.
Thanks. What I'm going to talk about, it's a little bit what Sarah said, but it's a little bit not like that. I'm going to talk about 2 parts of the line that you see here between land and water. It's a very important line. It's the line that connects us. President Kennedy said, the ocean doesn't separate us, it connects us. And that's been essential in New Bedford's history. And in my work, I have focused on my hometown, New Bedford. Not that it matters, I'm descended from the Roaches. I care an awful lot about my hometown. As Sarah said, I was mayor, and when I ran for mayor, I said, I love New Bedford, and I've spent my time trying to make my hometown a better place. And so the first part of this talk is going to be about the land side of this edge between land and water. When I spent some time with various organizations that we'll talk about, revitalizing the area around here, around the Bethel, the Waterfront Historic District. The second part of the talk will be about the water side of that edge, with my work with very smart people like Mark there in the back, who work with me at NOAA, trying to keep our living marine resources healthy, because New Bedford is always dependent on healthy living marine resources. So my work at NOAA is on the water side of that. So my career has been on either side of that edge. And the talk started a little bit when I was having dinner at one of the wonderful celebrations that the Whaling Museum has, with sitting next to Sarah, and a discussion about a whaling village. And I said, you know, the idea about this area, this Waterfront Historic District, has never been about creating a whaling village like Plymouth Plantation or Mystic. It's always been about history as a continuum. And you can get that picture. I can't think of a better place to give this talk than right in this room, because as you look around at these cenotaphs, you will see the essence of New Bedford. We send our people to sea. As I would say to people when I was mayor, you want to understand New Bedford? One word: seaport. We send our people to sea. They don't always come back, unfortunately, but they go to sea. And the stories on these cenotaphs, which are, of course, gravestones for people who don't have graves. And some of them are the stories of people lost in faraway places like the Indian Ocean in the 19th century. And some of them, the Irene and Hilda, 1980, or the Navigator, 1974. You see a picture of a continuous relationship, a working relationship with the ocean. One that I hope, and my job today is to see continues sustainably into the future. That is what New Bedford is, a seaport with a working relationship to the ocean. And it begins with this line. And you can, if the most important thing you have is that connecting line, which if you are looking at it from very high up in space, it seems to be not a straight line, but a minimal line. And that edge is the most important thing you have. Then what do you want to do with that edge? Well, you want to maximize it, don't you? You want to make it as long as you can. So that's, of course, what people in New Bedford and every other seaport do, is they make that edge as long as you can. You take a straight line and you make it go like this, right? So that it's as long as possible. And then, what do you do with it? You build lots of boats, so that long edge has lots of things that go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And so, whether it's whale ships or fishing boats, here's a guy who just came back on one, Don Cuddy. You know, it's what connects us to the rest of the world. It's commerce. It is the energy. Herman Melville, were he to walk around New Bedford today, would not get lost. Whether he were going to see New Bedford Ship Supply or Dawson Boat Settlements, we don't have to dress people up in old clothes to understand the functions of a seaport. It's still doing what it's always done. And I hope, and I think a lot of people hope, will always be that way. And so we're very proud of our history. And we have a wonderful museum across the way, but this is a port that is alive. And when I had the great fortune to come sail into New Bedford Harbor on the Charles W. Morgan, another ancestor of mine, right near on the Jaguar as the Morgan came in, I could feel the Morgan, who spends all her time, you know, in a museum village next to dead ships. When she came into New Bedford and tied up next to ships with beating hearts, believe me, she knew it. She knew it. And she'd been sailing in Buzzards Bay, going 8 knots and moving for the first time in 100+ years. And I know she knew it. And I knew she knew what it was like to be home among ships whose hearts were beating. And I knew that was a meaningful time for her. So, at any rate, this talk is about both sides of the most important part of any city. It's hard to think of a city that anywhere inland that didn't grow up around the water's edge, whether it's a river or a lake, Great Lakes, wherever, Europe, you name it, Constantinople, pick a city that didn't originate around the water's edge, because again, it's the water that connects us, and that is certainly the case with New Bedford. Now, I used to give this talk all the time, but that was many years ago. As I told my students when I was at SEA, I was mayor in the late 1900s. And so all the slides, you don't even have slides anymore, right? That's a technology from another millennium, or in some dustbin somewhere. So I've borrowed a technology from Whale, and I'm grateful to them. So it's imperfect for the story I want to tell, but I do want to tell about the revival of this district using Whale-centric slides. But it is important that this work involved not just Whale, but also the Whaling Museum, and also a group called the Bedford Landing Taxpayers Association. You can get the idea of what they were about by just the name Taxpayers Association, right? Get that? What is Whale and the Whaling Museum and even the Port Society but a bunch of non-taxpayers? So the Taxpayers Association were all the businesses that supported the fishing industry and everything else that were very suspicious of all these non-taxpayers, and they didn't want anyone telling them what color to paint their damn door. So I worked for all of those groups. The Port Society was supportive, but as a religious organization, they said, we'll cheer you on from the sidelines, but we're supportive. And so Whale started because they looked around and they saw a lot going on that didn't happen to be very good for, if you liked old buildings. And they were founded by George Perkins, Steve Delano, Peter Grinnell, very far-sighted people. And I always described Whale as a bunch of ordinary people who, when they got together, did extraordinary things. It was magical in many ways. These three characters, foremost among them, with a few others, one of whom will get special mention in a minute or two. At any rate, this is Water Street with the Whaling Museum looming in the background. The Whaling Museum's done an awful lot of good stuff, but one of the things that troubled Whale was that it had a tendency to take down historic buildings so that it could save historic paintings. And they thought there was an inconsistency in that. And so Whale formed as a separate organization. That was very good for New Bedford because the Old Dartmouth Historical Society has a mission of being in business forever, which is a very long time. And that means you have to be very conservative. And in saving old buildings, you can't be conservative. You have to put it all on the line, every deal you do. And so most communities, the Historical Society is also the Preservation Society, and that doesn't work very well. In New Bedford, because you had the Whaling Museum as separate from Whale, it worked out to the advantage. But Whale looked around, and urban renewal came to New Bedford. And in a lot of cities, urban renewal started in residential areas and tearing down neighborhoods in order to save them. In New Bedford, urban renewal was very far-sighted and decided to focus on jobs and the waterfront, New Bedford's major asset. And so Whale said, we are going to try and affect what's going on. We're not just going to be a knee-jerk opposition organization. So here's the beginning of South Terminal, which totally made possible the seafood processing business. Here is clearing land for 195, which was going to link seafood processing to New York and other markets. But all of it involved the demolition of a number of buildings. Here's Route 18. Here is South Water and Potomska. Here you probably recognize the downtown in the upper left and the so-called octopus interchange here. And here's South Terminal, downtown parking area, some lovely buildings in Wells Square, part of the downtown. And so Whale is looking at this going along, saying we need to get some people together to save our heritage. I remember coming back from graduate school and being shocked at the finality of the why, and waking up in the morning saying, we can't put this back together again, can we? It's gone. And later on, talking to Tim Anderson, an architect in Boston who had a picture of the Y in his office, and I said, you got a picture of the Y? He said, yeah, we're going to fix it up. I said, Tim, newsflash, it's leveled. He said, what? What are you talking about? He said, why? And I said, because it's structurally unsound. He said, well, you got to be kidding me. That's one of the strongest buildings I've ever seen in my life. And I said, well, yeah, it's gone, unfortunately. And so, right next to City Hall, never to be, so with historic preservation, as you know, you have to win the battle every day. You only get to lose it once, and once you lose it, it's like extinction of a species. And this in 1975, as I was just starting to work for Whale, was motivational for me. We also lost a number of theaters, the Olympia, the Empire. The Zeiterion is a beautiful theater. It wasn't the most beautiful one, as those of you who went to theaters know. It was the last one, but it wasn't the best one. I'm glad we saved it. But the Empire and the Olympia were wonderful theaters. So at any rate, here, as Mike mentioned, is Whale's first office on Water and Center Street. And Whale started with this amazing woman, my cousin, Sarah Delano, as its first president. This lady had more courage and more vision than, Mike showed a list of all the leaders back in the 19th century. This lady you could stand Sarah Delano up against that list, I think, of civic leaders, and it'd be an even match, I think. Sarah Delano had a lot of vision and a lot of courage. The head of the redevelopment at the time, Howard Baptista, was a big black guy. I knew Howard, he's a wonderful guy. And you had to be a very strong person to be head of the redevelopment authority, because you were dealing with lots of controversy, lots of angry community meetings. There were riots and stuff like that. Howard told me once, or he didn't necessarily tell me, but I found out probably from Howard Nickerson. Howard told me, Howard Baptista was only afraid of one person in New Bedford, this lady. And but Whale again was trying to work with and not just be a knee-jerk opposition group. The Redevelopment Authority actually had a plan to revitalize the waterfront historic districts. There was an orange book, and I don't know if the Whaling Museum's got a copy of it. It was a very sophisticated urban renewal plan. It issued standards for revitalization that would have resulted in an absolutely amazing restoration of this district. The only problem was it would have caused everyone to have to move out. And so it would have been physical restoration and social annihilation. And, but at the time, it was very sophisticated urban renewal. And what happened was Lester Lima got shot in the West End, and priorities changed, and the urban renewal turned its attention to the West End and basically demolished the West End of New Bedford to fix it up. And so Wales said, okay, if we're not going to fix up the waterfront historic district, we'll enact Chapter 40C to protect it, and we'll figure out something else. And so they did an inventory. They got Antoinette Downing. They started acquiring some buildings, but not much was happening. And I got out of graduate school in '74, and I said I would work for all the organizations here, but I wouldn't work for any one of them. And I had, as a graduate student, interviewed with all of them. They all hated each other. They were suspicious of one another, but they all had the same goals, which is we want to save the buildings, we want to support the fishing industry, we don't want to be a museum village. And this area was filled with vacant buildings. The streets and utilities were horrible. It was the worst section economically in the city. Bad bars, high crime, you know, it was just one of the worst sections of the city. And so I went to work for all of them for $10,000 a year, great salary. The next year they gave me a huge bonus, went all the way up to $12,000 a year. And what happened in that year, 1974, under Nixon, was he combined a lot of federal programs into something called the Community Development Block Grant Program. And New Bedford had $10 million. And I went up to Jack Markey and said, you should fix up the waterfront historic district. And he said, are you nuts? And, but we kept talking to him about it, and $10 million was a lot of money. And he was persuaded. And I said, I don't work for you, Mr. Mayor. I work for all the people down here. And we all know what we want with this area. And we're willing to do our part. And we'll be with you as a team. And to his great credit, he said, okay, I'll do it. I'll work with you guys. And we became a fantastic team with his administration, George Brightman, head of DPW, Ben Baker, head of the city planning department, and Huey Murray, head of the wire department. I mean, it was an amazing team effort. And all kinds of stuff started happening. And so Whale, and every problem was like, okay, what do we all bring to the table? Whale can acquire real estate, which the city can't do, and the city can bring community development funds. We'll put the public money in the public way, streets and sidewalks, and we'll start to target with Whale some of the decrepit buildings around here, and we'll just get stuff going. And all this is ledge, And if we're going to, you know, we went to the utility company saying, you guys got to get on board. So you need to blast ledge. And I tell you, if you want to get people's attention, dynamite I recommend dynamite. And because it gets people's attention right away. And so dynamite worked. Everyone knew something was happening. And so things started to happen. And Wales started to do not one or two buildings, but, oh, jeepers, look at that list. Lots of buildings. And here's a little building we worked on. This building, no one even knew it existed. It was built in 1820, and then in 1870 they built buildings all around it. You couldn't see this building without a helicopter. I walked into Electric Surplus and Sales, owned by Roland Poitras, and he sold fluorescent light bulbs. And I go up to the counter and I see these huge steps out of granite. I say, Roland, where do these steps go? He said, come with me. And I walk up these front steps that take me into the front door of the Robeson house. And I walk into this door into these 4 rooms, you know, with wallpaper that hadn't been used since 1870. I'd say, what is this, Roland? He says, these are my storerooms for my light bulbs. I'd say, holy moly, does anybody know about this? Well, I don't know. So he's got this beautiful 1876 warehouse in front. Now, we don't want to tear that building down. And so we say, well, we got to do something about this. And there was a vacant lot, you know, a kitty corner. The only problem was, how do you get there? And this looks like it's made of brick, but it's not really made of brick. It's made of rubble stone covered in brick. Every brick had been shipped from Philadelphia wrapped in paper. And so Mr. Carter from Carter's Army-Navy store owned the parking lot next to it. They had built the largest commercial building next to it. I go to Mr. Carter, who's a tough cookie, and say, can we move the building across your parking lot? And he says, sure, just not between Thanksgiving and Christmas. That's when I do all my business. I said, I promise. Now, this huge commercial building that connected Freestones with his Army-Navy store had a building in the parking lot. It caught fire, and they paved it over by filling the basement with crushed newspaper and then putting asphalt on it. And so when we put this 550-ton building on top of the asphalt, it would immediately sink 2 feet, and then we'd drag it up a foot. We'd get about a foot a day. And I watched it once, then I almost had a heart attack at age, 28. And so I just stopped watching. And we had it out in the middle of the street on the day after Thanksgiving, exactly when we told Mr. Carter we wouldn't have it in blocking the street. So that was almost heart attack number 2. And then I realized let me see, you see it there on the top right between Freestones and the Custom House. I'd realized 2 things. One, I hadn't measured it correctly. It was a foot wider than I had measured it. And 2, I'd measured it down where I could hold the tape easy. I should have measured it up where the gutters were, because this thing scraped both the Custom House and Freestones. And the other thing was, Freestones wasn't really Freestones, it was the Peakwood Lounge, which was a drug den. It was one of 2 free fire zones in the city. Free fire meaning if the cops needed to get someone, it was either going to be at the Peakwood Lounge or at the Tropicana. And everyone was figuring out, what do we do with this bar? Well, I tell you, if you park a building like that 1 foot in front of the door, it tends to cut into their business. And Freddie Almeida decided he would move his business, and that was good too. And so that helped out. At any rate, we moved it, rotated it 90 degrees, did some work, and sold it. And it's now law offices for Phil Beauregard. And it was a partnership with the city, which provided a lot of the money, but Whale did it. So if you can, it's not moving mountains. I think this was heavier than a lot of mountains, but here were two other buildings that the Redevelopment Authority, as part of their neighborhood demolition, this is the way we save neighborhoods, to tear down buildings like this. Whale bought these from the demolition contractor. People said, hey, what is Whale doing going in and hurting neighborhoods like this? We didn't buy it from the neighborhood. We bought it from the demolition contractor, who was going to just turn it into, you know, take it to the city yard. And we put these on 2nd Street. This was the building that was in front of the Robeson House. And we fixed that up and sold it to Pearpoint Glass, brought Pearpoint Glass, at least for a while, back into the city. This was Henry Beadle, you know, of Beadle Boat Works. This was in the middle of the Octopus, also bought from the Redevelopment Authority as they were demolishing to make way for the Octopus. And this was another one bought from the Redevelopment Authority, put onto Center Street, and Alan and Mary Scott moved in here. And then part of the synergy was they were some of the very early residents of Center Street. Alan and Mary, both artists, and they said, now that we're here, John, we want to have a summer festival and celebrate what's going on. We'd started to, you know, repair the streets, thanks to Mayor Markey, with trees and paving blocks and human scale street lights that we had cast from one that we found up at a city building on Shawmut Avenue. We want to celebrate. And so Alan and Mary put together with the Preservation Society the first Center Street Summer Festival, a juried music festival and craft show. And it was I won't say instantaneous success because of how much work they put into it. But it was, you couldn't see Center Street, it was so successful. You couldn't see all the wonderful improvements we put because they just did such a great job. And that Center Street Summer Festival morphed into Summerfest, and it's what is now being done, I think, by the Korolenkos and the Zeiterion as a celebration of music and arts and culture. And Alan and Mary and Carl Cabano, who'd come to me and said, I want to live up above your office. Carl was an artist in residence, who were really the first artists to come into this district. Right below this building, next to a ruin, the McCullough ruin, when my first day at work, there were 3 winos. I got out of my car and locked my car, and Gary, one of the winos, said, what are you locking your car for? I said, well, basically because of you. And he said, no, you don't have to lock your car. You know, if anything happens to it, you know, the police are going to give us a hard time, and we're going to not like that, so your car is going to be safe. I said, that's very rational. I'm still locking my car, but, you know, we got along fine. You know, 2 weeks later, I'd see Dick Alcobia from the National Club run right by with blood coming out of his gut, and you know, so it was a difficult neighborhood. And I remember Buddy Cianci coming over, I don't know, 20 years later, saying, we use artists like the Marines. We send them into neighborhoods because they can see what others can't. And they go in first because they can see what others can't. And they make areas cool. And the only problem is they get gentrified out, and you have to find ways to protect them. But if any city knows that, well, certainly Providence does, but New Bedford does. I mean, we have built downtown and this district and a number of neighborhoods on the backs of artists who have seen the value of a place and who've come in and who've made it safe and made it cool for others. Because artists do that. They see it. But at any rate, Alan and Mary, when Mary died, Alan had a tragic end, and Mary married John Magna. And when Mary died of ovarian cancer, her son Travis, who's sailing around the world, Travis at her funeral said, I always thought people pissing in my backyard was kind of normal growing up. You know, that's what the neighborhood was like. But at any rate, credit goes to them. You know, you fix up a building and pioneers come in, and they then start adding to the neighborhood. They add. They figure out, what can I bring? I can bring my craft, my art, but I can then start to, I love the word neighbor. I love the word neighbor because it's a relationship. You can't be a neighbor by yourself. You can only be a neighbor in relationship to somebody else. And they started to make this a neighborhood. Here's their next door building. The lower left it had ailanthus trees growing up, you know, through it. Here's the Seth Russell house, may be the oldest house in downtown New Bedford. The story is, and it was located on the block of the Whaling Museum, that when the Brits came in 1778 and marched through Quaker New Bedford to go get the rowdies in Fairhaven at Fort Phoenix, who were giving the Brits all kinds of trouble. They landed in Clark's Cove and marched up here, and they're torching everything in its wake. They lit this building on fire, and there was a woman in this building who put it out. So they lit it on fire again. She put it out again, and they lit it again. She put it out a third time. Finally, they said, I don't want to deal with this lady anymore, and they kept marching north and crossed and then went down to Fairhaven. So this is the only building that predates the Revolution. And it was on Union Street with its front door on not on the gable side the way it is now. So the Whaling Museum wanted to build its library in the old days. Before this partnership, they would have just torn this down. Instead, we worked a deal where they gave it to Whale. Whale moved it to the foot of Union Street. And Kevin Dawson settles trips for the fishing industry, which is like what happened in the old counting houses. And the form of payment's the same. Everybody gets a lay. So this is the same thing that's been going on for, you know, hundreds of years. It goes on right here at Dawson Ship Settlements. Continuity of use. Rodman Candle Works. This was a mixed-use neighborhood, right? We had fancy mansion houses like the Roach House, and almost right across the street is a candle factory. If you can think of a more noxious use than squeezing spermaceti oil to make candles, I don't know what it is, but right across the street, this was built in 1810, and it had been vacant for 70 years. When Whale partnered, because it's a big building and it was complicated, and we got New Bedford 5-cent savings bank. You remember savings banks? They used to be around here. We got New Bedford 5 to be in the first and second floor, a law firm to be in the third floor, and then they had a basement that was about 5 feet headroom. And Andy Burns worked for ACT up in Boston, and at the time there was a Lebanese kitchen in Kings Highway up in the North End. Emil Kosaki had a real underground following. Everyone went for miles, and it was a pretty run-down place, but God, could he cook. And so I went to Emil saying, hey, Emil, you want to be part of this? We're going to dig out the basement, make all kinds of headroom. You can be part, you'll be our restaurateur. He said, sure. And so he came down, we were all set, dig out the basement. He partners with his gold broker, Maurice Jaspe. They're all set to go. And just as we're about to move him in, we see him running down Purchase Street off to Lebanon. And we never see him again, chased by creditors, I think. Maurice Jaspe says, I'll be your restaurateur. Maurice Jaspe's never cooked breakfast, as far as I know. And so we say, Maurice, we can't do this with you. He said, you're a year away from opening. I'll go learn. So he goes up to Boston, works in a fancy restaurant for a year. He comes back, and he runs a Candleworks restaurant for 15 years. Great place. And it's still a restaurant there. And so, still doing great stuff. Here's another building, my original office right there. And we had a lot of momentum so that even a small thing like explosions of 77, mayor called me at 4 in the morning saying the historic district just blew up. And it was a very cold January. A weld in a gas line cracked, gas leaked up under the snow, migrated into O'Malley's Tavern, furnace kicked on, and Mr. O'Malley's Tavern was vaporized. We had a building we just fixed up right next to O'Malley's Tavern called the Macomber-Sylvia Building. And you can see it's the one right in the middle. And it was also gone. We were going to sell it on Tuesday at noon. It was gone Tuesday at 4:45 in the morning. The hook and ladder pulled up in front of Union Tobacco Company, and just as all the firefighters got off the south side of the truck, a Union Tobacco blew up and sent a 40-foot-long I-beam into the hook and ladder. Demolished. Fortunately, didn't hit any firefighters. And so you can see the all of the windows in the Whaling Museum blew out. The Lagoda looked like it was trying to get the hell out of here, which is pretty smart. The Whaling Museum had a number of buildings filled with gas, which were very fortunate to vent out. About an hour later, the Eggers Building, that's the Macomber-Sylvia Building. We're going to sell it, as I said, at noon. The Sundial Building was owned by State Fruit. That's what it looked like on the top right. The mayor was going to, the building inspector was going to tear it down. We called up the mayor and said, you can't tear it down just because of a little fire damage. And we went to the Whaling Museum and said, this is on your block, your master plan says you should own it, so you need to buy it right now. The Karolikas family had it for sale for $87,000 in that condition. And Whaling Museum, as I said, being the conservative entity that it is, said we can't buy it. it's too big a liability. Whale had just lost the building I showed you. I had $3,000 of bills on my desk and $500 of cash in our bank account. So we said, of course, we'll buy it for $87,000. So the explosion is on Tuesday. We buy it on Saturday. And we had the roof had collapsed from this shape to that shape and was pressing the walls out. And we had the roof taken out by Tuesday, so 1 week after the explosion, to stabilize the structure. And then we go to the city, and as I say, we sit around the table in the mayor's office, and it's okay, we have a problem. It's not you have a problem, it's we have a problem. How are we going to do it? And it was amazing. That's the way it always got approached. How do we do it? Okay, Whale, you did what you do well, which is to act fast. So, you know, here's what we can do. We can get money and stuff. We had just started a fundraise, and so we went and bumped up our goal, you know, more than doubled our goal, and people responded because they liked the fact that Whale went out and acted, so that, you know, they responded in kind. We fixed it up so it looked like what was in the bottom, and eventually sold it to the Whaling Museum because it is on their block, it is part of their plan. And once it didn't represent an unlimited liability, they said, okay, now it does make sense for us. So it all worked out in the end, and it is now, you know, a really good part of the Whaling Museum. About an hour after the first explosion, this building, the Eggers building, which you can see has Kroll's art sign hanging out front, blew its roof off. This building, when I first came here, this building had like 150 phone lines heading into it. That's when, before lottery, when the numbers was a big thing. 100 phone lines going into this building. I wonder what they do in there. Anyway, the Whaling Museum says, we don't want this next to our theater. It represents a fire hazard. I said, what do you mean a fire hazard? It's already blown up. It didn't do a nickel's worth of damage to the theater. Why don't you leave it there? No, get it out of here. So it's now right down the hill, and it's all fixed up and back in business. Zoe Whale also helped work on the Ernestina, which is a connection to the fishing industry. It's up in Booth Bay, and it's another big project, cause for another talk another day. But a very important continuing link to fishing, to immigration to Cape Verde, and Arctic exploration to fishing. And needs to be part of the story we tell. Whale has also been involved with the city in partnership with Custom House Square, where recruits in the Civil War were recruited. Whale has also been part of redesigning Route 18 so that it's not a highway and not as much a barrier to the sea, which is, again, making connections to the source of all energy. And also instrumental in bringing the national park here. And Whale has had some other great leaders, Tony Souza, Lisa Bergson, Terry Bernard, and other great board leaders. And it's a very strong organization right now. You've seen this slide with Mike showed it to you. The reason I want to show it to you here is that this building has, first of all, when we went to the city and said we want public investment in the public way, we looked at history first of all, and one of the problems was high-speed through traffic, and people just buzzing through the district. And you can see the paving material here are cobblestones. They'd been replaced with paving blocks, and most of the streets still had paving blocks. And we said, we think if we return to paving blocks, we can consider those speed bumps. And besides being historic, they'll slow people down. And it's important to slow people down in this district. And so we persuaded the city to do that. And so there's a modern reason for those paving blocks. They're a pain in the neck for people in high heels, and they're a maintenance issue. But the major purpose was not just a visual reference to history, but we want to slow people down and make this a pedestrian area. The sidewalks were a vocabulary of bluestone and brick and paving blocks and cobblestone and some grass. We hired an architect, Tom Houck, a wonderful person, went around to every property owner and said, what do you want? And we custom designed every sidewalk. Same with the trees. We went around and said, here's the vocabulary of trees. What do you want? There were a lot of elms. Elms were out of the picture because we couldn't guarantee disease-resistant elms. So we used a variation that would give the same vase shape. And as I said, we found original street lights. We cast from those original street lights so that you get a light that shines in your face instead of illuminating the top of your head. And all to encourage pedestrian travel and historic reference. This building, when we started in the 70s, was lived in illegally by the president of the Bedford Landing Taxpayers Association, Bill Johnson, and his wife, Bee. And he owned, as you see here, Johnson's Auto Parts. And then he got clever and he said, you know, we're getting tourists here. It became Johnson's Antiques. And then he said, you know, even better than selling antiques to tourists, I bet I can sell, now that Compass Bank got a lot of publicity with the Rod McKenna Works, I bet I can sell this to New Bedford Institution for Savings. So he sold it to New Bedford Institution for Savings for even more money. And Bob McCarter brought in Mitch Miller for all the concerts, which was cool. And then Bob McCarter looked at the Peakwood Lounge across the street, this bad bar, and he said, I don't like having this across the street. He had been head of Springfield Institution for Savings. He went up to the people running Fitzwillies, Debbie Seguin, Mike Galusa, Kerry Mitchell, and he said, why don't you guys, I'll give you, lend you all the money you need. Just come down and open up a restaurant. And he didn't tell them that in New Bedford even McDonald's closed at 5 o'clock at night. But they came down here, they were unfamiliar with our customs, opened up Freestone's first restaurant. And they found out, you know why even McDonald's closes? Why no one goes out to dinner in New Bedford? Because there isn't any place that's open. And as soon as they opened Freestone's, people were lined up around the place. So you know, one thing leads to another, And then it turned into the national park. And it's a wonderful, wonderful partner. So on the land side, respect history, learn from what worked, make it part of the present, just as this building is. History is a continuum, and it's all about people, whether it's Sarah Delano, whether it's Bill Johnson, whether it's Bob McCarter, whoever it is. It's all about working people, people, people. So now to the wet side of the line. This is from a report the city commissioned, how the impact of the wet side. 36,000 jobs generated by port activity, $9 billion. New Bedford's been the highest value fishing port in the U.S. since the year 2000. #1 port in the country. Let that sink in for most of the last 20 years. Scallop landings worth $322 million in 2016. It's a huge impact, this port. That's not just fishing, but huge impact the wet side has on this city. So my job is to maintain fish and fishermen in a changing environment, and it's not simple. So what's NOAA, the National Organization for the Advancement of Acronyms? No, sorry, Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And so NOAA's mission is we enrich life through science, from the surface of the sun to the depths of the ocean. So that's NOAA, and it includes things like the Weather Service, National Environment, Satellite Data Information System, as well as NOAA Fisheries. So we're in the Department of Commerce, and then you have NOAA, which is half of the Department of Commerce. And then inside NOAA, there is NOAA Fisheries, which is where I work. So our mission is stewardship of marine life through science-based conservation and habitats. And our region that I'm responsible for is Canada down to Cape Hatteras. So that's the region I work in. And one of my jobs is the Magnuson-Stevens Fishery Management and Conservation Act, which is a little over 40 years old now. And that is fisheries. Also deal with the Endangered Species Act and the Marine Mammal Protection Act. So we monitor fish stocks. We work with fishermen to develop improved fishing methods. We restore and protect coastal ocean habitat that is important to fish populations. And we work, and this is very important and very different than other environmental legislation like the Clean Water Act or Clean Air Act. We work in partnership with regional councils to set limits of when, where, and how many fish can be caught. That partnership with councils is complicated, democratic, and very important in how this works. I want to quickly talk to you about a couple of examples. Good, bad, and the changing. Good, scallop fishery. Not so good, groundfish fishery. And the changing environment. So the scallop fishery, which is, this is the home of scallop fishery, is groundfish areas closed to scallops in 1994. I was working for the scallop industry in the early 90s. They were flat on their back. It was not a good, healthy industry back then. Stocks were declared overfished, but they established a rotational access area. In the 2000s, now it's a healthy fishery, and it's managed with different size vessels. It's not one size fits all. There's a days at sea system for large boats called limited access boats, and there's individual transferable quotas for smaller boats called general category boats. Biology of scallops are different than groundfish. They can reproduce starting at 2 years. They can produce millions of eggs each year, and they can respond very quickly to management. So they have certain advantages going for them. And so if you look at over time, if you look here, let me see, on the left of the screen, you see in the 1980s, and the groundfish plan closed areas to scallops in 1994. They did this not to protect scallops, they did this to protect groundfish. But in doing that, they also protected scallops. That wasn't the purpose, but it meant that there were areas off limits to scallopers. In 1999, these areas, you can see scallops started to grow. 1999, these areas were reopened. And since that time, you can see how scallops have grown. And the people in the industry remember back to those days in the 90s. They never want to go back to those days. Scallops were very small, and no one was making much money. Now, the scallops are very big. It's healthy. They've got a really good system, and they produce their own research. They really are an industry. And they can think ahead decades. So they work well with government. They work well with academia, like UMass Dartmouth. So they've got a very good system going. Yeah, go ahead.
I can see what happened with the closing and the opening of the thing, and then it leveled off, going slightly down, and then it skyrocketed. What happened at that skyrocketing point?
Not sure. Not sure.
Something happened.
Yeah. But it's right now, it's abundant. It produces good year classes frequently. It's resilient, and it's a little bit like abundance yields abundance. And so it's not without some challenges, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So good cooperation. They produce over $10 million worth of private funded research every year. As I said, good cooperation with academic partners like SMAST and Virginia Institute of Marine Science. They pay for their own observers. So, on the other hand, if you look at multi-species or groundfish, for a long time, it's been problematic. Some historians say one of the difficulties is when they moved from schooners to dories. You think about the footprint of a schooner being this, and then you move to dories, and all of a sudden the footprint, the dory is expanding that dramatically. And so 1860s moved using hand lines to tub trawls, could fish hundreds of hooks. So technology has been part of the issue for a long time. Spencer Baird in 1872, excessive and ill-timed fishing has had due share of influence in depleting the original supply. So there's a lot of talk about overfishing now. The point of this is that people have been decrying this for a long time. There was 100 years ago attempts by Honey Fitz, the mayor of Boston, the Gloucester Times, scientists in partnership with industry going down to Washington to outlaw the otter trawl. It's the last time really science and industry worked together was 1915. So if you look here, you see in 1850 where the stocks were, and more recently it's been at levels much lower than that. And since 1980, you can measure relative 1980 to 2015, but I just want to go back and say that's still much, much lower than what it was back 100 years ago. And so we're in a bad place as far as Gulf of Maine cod goes. The other thing that contrasts with scallops is recruitment. What recruitment means is, do baby cod recruit in and become older fish where you can actually catch them? And as you look back in the left side of this chart, you'll see with most fish, you have good years and bad years. So you have spikes, it goes up and down. But recently, cod can't catch a break. They have repeated years of bad recruitment. Whereas with scallops or with haddock, plentiful species, they generate good recruiting years like every other year. So it's like the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. Cod just can't get a good recruiting class to help them out. They have bad luck, they're in bad shape, and they have bad luck on top of it. And you just love to see them get a good recruiting year, something that you could build on, but they don't seem to be able to generate a break. And so that compounds the problem. So the other issue that you have is perceptions of reality, which is that fishermen say, we see lots of cod, and scientists say, we don't see cod. How can you have differing perceptions of reality? And fishermen are out there all the time. That's the real-time observations. They're there all the time. They do year-round sampling. They, because they're hunters, are going where the fish are. So otherwise they wouldn't stay fishing very long. And so they know where the fish are. So they're sampling in certain areas. And so that's where they see the fish. Scientists have sampling protocols. They are indirectly involved, and they have to sample the whole area. So they see where the fish are, but they also see where they aren't. And they're not doing it all the time. So you get these differences which lead to different pictures. And because you have these different pictures, you therefore have a recipe for distrust. And you don't get this problem with scallops because the scallop picture is a good picture, so nobody argues with one another because there's lots of money to go around, there's lots of scallops to go around. But with groundfish, you get this picture because everyone is under tremendous economic stress. And so on top of this, you get an environment that's hostile. Cod is a cold water species. The Gulf of Maine is warming faster than any other body of water in the world. You can see it here. Off of Japan, it's pretty warm. Off certain parts of Alaska, it's pretty warm. But off of New England, that's where it's really warm. And acidification, the other problem in pumping a lot of CO2 into the atmosphere causes acidification. That can cause problems as well. And so the fisheries that are affected and vulnerable to this include groundfish, lobster, skates, you can read the others. Scallops can be affected by acidification. Anything that takes carbon and uses carbon to make calcium carbonate, a shell, a lobster, a scallop, anything that eats anything that uses a shell. You know, a whale eats pteropods, things like that can be a problem. Eats not shrimp, what am I thinking of? Krill. So, so scallops are sensitive to ocean acidification. So while I said that scallops are healthy in some ways, in other ways there's still some things to be worried about. Cod is subject to temperature, and the Gulf of Maine is warming. And so you can see in 1968 prevalence in the red, and you can see in 2012 less prevalence, but you can also see where are the cod prevalent. It's right off of Gloucester. So when the people in Gloucester say, I see cod, well, yeah, you can see cod. They're right off of Gloucester. But that's the only place they are, right off of Gloucester. The other place they're yellow is in Canadian waters. So, but it's not all bad news, because what you can see here is spawning stock biomass. This is more groundfish than there were 20 years ago. It's just there's only 3 species that define this. The red is redfish, the yellow is haddock, Georges Bank haddock, and the blue is pollock, and all of which are delicious fish to eat. And so the challenge for fishermen is, how do I catch redfish, pollock, and haddock without catching cod? So that's the challenge for the fishing industry, is how do I catch the red, the yellow, and the blue? And that's the challenge for us working with the fishing industry, is if your business plan is, I just want to catch cod, then that's not a very good business plan. The mayor of Gloucester came up to me and said, I want you to help me make Gloucester once again the redfish capital of the world. Well, look at all the red there. The problem with redfish is it's 60 to 80 cents a pound. You know, so our challenge is, if you've ever had Mayor Safathia Romeo Thakin come up to you, she weighs about, I shouldn't say right now, but she is a force of nature. If she ever comes up to you, she's a great cook with a bowl of redfish soup. Believe me, you want to take it, because it is delicious. And as I said, pollock and haddock are delicious. So that's the answer, is how do you shift to species that are abundant and stop fishing for species that aren't abundant? So this is the human component. This is our challenge. There are answers here that have to do with resilience. You can't have a fishing community without both fish and fishermen. So the questions we have are tough. How do you increase flexibility to respond to distribution and abundance changes? How do you be adaptive and more diverse? And New Bedford is an excellent example, because if you look just within the fishing industry, it's very diverse. It's scallops, it's groundfish, it's red crab, it's offshore lobster, it's monkfish, and I'm probably missing. Don will talk more about it. I'm sure I've missed 2 or 3. But it's very diverse within fishing, but it's not just fishing. It's offshore wind, it's ferries, it's short sea shipping, it's recreational boating. I mean, it is a diverse maritime economy here that New Bedford is building. How do you maintain both in light of reduced quotas resulting from poor stock health? How do you set quotas so you rebuild fish stocks without driving fishermen out of business, without driving the boatyards out of business, without driving the ice houses? This is not so much a problem in New Bedford as it is in a place like Gloucester. How do you control fleet consolidation, which has been happening for a while? And what are the impacts on the shoreside infrastructure, the ice houses, etc.? So, lastly, wrapping up, the world is changing. It's not a status quo anymore. I used to think of this as dealing with still pictures, and now it's all moving pictures, because when the temperature changes or the pH changes, fish move. Everything starts moving now, so all the pictures are moving. So sea level rise, the level, all these things move. Everything moves. And so how do you adapt? Again, New Bedford is in great shape. There's only 2 ports with hurricane barriers, Providence and New Bedford. Every city's going to want one. New Bedford and Providence are the only 2 that have them. So it puts New Bedford in a competitive, great place. Biological, poor recruitment, which I talked about, declining fish health, distribution and ecosystem shifts, right whales, which I've been spending a lot of time on recently, because there's only about 450 of them, and the threats are myriad in this whaling capital. To think of what's going on now with right whales, which may be food availability, is very serious issues. So much in the environment is changing. So we can restore buildings, we can regulate fishing, but how do you manage climate change on this? How do we turn the temperature down in the Gulf of Maine? If someone has the answer to that question, come up to me after the talk, all right? Because that would help a lot of things right away, I know that. So this is how we're responding. We're trying to provide science to our partners, our Northeast Science Centers in Woods Hole. We're trying to manage coastal zone, working with the councils on building resilient management plans. We're trying to prepare contingency plans. We have a resiliency workshop on June 27th, 28th with local leaders, including we invited the mayor. I think he's sending Ed Washburn up to go over that, and engagement with waterfront communities such as New Bedford. So I appreciate very much your time and attention on this. It's been a pleasure to be part of this really important symposium.